thought I would be speaking to in describing Nate's unique contributions and his enormous influence in our field has already been covered. So I'll just make a few brief points, probably no more than 2 or 3, in trying to both situate and calibrate the remarkable research record that Nate Rosenberg compiled, keeping in mind that I and everyone else on this panel, I suspect, are really talking about only part of his research record. We're devoting essentially no attention to his also influential work in the history of economic thought. As many people, I think beginning with Dick Nelson, first thing this morning, pointed out, Nate's research really was a ground-up, inductive approach to the study of innovation and the economic history of technology that emphasized diversity among technologies, and indeed diversity among sectors and institutions. And with that in mind, it's remarkable, and it involved a deep grounding in the details of individual technologies and institutions in life. And what is striking, I think, are several things about that. One is the sheer breadth of coverage of different topics, different technologies, different systems that Nate's research covered. We go back in the 19th century to the study expedition of the British group from the 1851 Crystal Palace exhibition, the wooden balloon frame house, the machine tools industry, the coreless steam engine, into the 20th century, the commercial aircraft industry, the chemicals industry, and the medical equipment industries. This is an enormous breadth, and in each of these areas, Nate was really working from the ground up. So I think it's both the ground up approach, but it's also the number of different areas in which he was working that I think are quite remarkable. And as I said, coming back to the point about institutional diversity, Nate also devoted a great deal of attention to the role of institutions, and in particular the role of different types of institutions engaged in the process of innovation and diffusion. We can obviously point to industrial R&D labs, research universities, academic medical research centers, each of which in many respects represents a slightly different ecology of innovation, and all of which he worked intensively on, including a good deal of field work in a leading industrial research lab at the time, Bell Labs, much of which field work underpinned his influential paper on How Exogenous is Science. And I think also this focus on institutions in many ways helped lay the groundwork for and anticipated much of the innovation systems work that has arisen in parallel with and subsequent to. Another point about Nate's span of topics and fields and subjects of study is the fact that we talk about interdisciplinary research. We talk as economists or historians in many cases about collaborating with people within our field who focus on different subspecialties. In some cases, perhaps we collaborate across fields, rarely across fields within the social sciences. Nate Rosenberg, on the other hand, was collaborating and co-authoring with medical researchers, with engineers in the form of Ralph Landau, Walter Vincenti, and Steve Klein, and medical researcher Anatine Jalines. This is remarkable in terms of, again, the breadth and the level of both intellectual security, if you will, and intellectual adventurousness that enabled him both to communicate with and to work with and synthesize, I think, a number of very important papers that involved a great deal of bilateral exchange and flow of information and knowledge. But I think with the possible exception of Dick Nelson, economists doing field work is particularly unusual and extremely rare, even nowadays within US management schools.
Nate was a very close friend of mine, and as a person, he was really full of anecdotes, lively conversationalist, a man of extremely broad interests, as well beyond even this very varied scope of study of machinery, of development of new products. I read his papers with great pleasure, though probably not with a deep understanding, because it came from such a different viewpoint than mine. But I always found, somehow I was reading a narrative, which seemed to be just kind of a story. But at the end of it, there was more than was contained in the story. I didn't just learn about machine tools. I somehow learned about the process in a way which I couldn't reduce to a nice formula, but nevertheless, it was clear somehow you got an insight into the nature of the interactions in a way which was both concrete and general at the same time. I can't quite describe it. I can't quite understand how it happened. His influence, he lives on, of course, it is a great influence on the developing thing, which is community. The very size of it here is already kind of remarkable, considering the small number that were involved in this 40 years ago, and to which so many here have contributed. Now, of course, I'm interested. Why do we have these peculiar set of institutions? We have a market. Why don't markets work? Now the markets don't work in a lot of cases. As soon as you get rigorously into general equilibrium theory, you find out what's wrong with it. Namely, that, for example, one of the things is you look at the number of markets that's supposed to be there and aren't there. Even something as simple as buying a commodity 3 years in advance. If I'm putting up a plant to produce automobiles, obviously what I want to do is sell the product years out. Why not? You really do that a little bit with agricultural goods and minerals, but maybe a year or two. With automobiles, you don't do it. Why not? You don't know what an automobile is going to be like in 5 years. I mean, there are other reasons, but that certainly is one of them. Why that you can't specify the automobile. So already innovation, the fact of innovation, in a way creates problems for the economy as all not only is the market for innovation is a difficult one, but it's it creates problems for other markets. What you have here is knowledge, and knowledge already is a commodity. It's a commodity. It's costly and it's valuable. What else would we buy a commodity? But it's reproducible at cost much less than the cost of production. The cost of reproduction is much less. That means, furthermore, if you transmit information, you have no less of it. It's unlike you sell steel, you don't have the steel. You have the information and the other person has the information. And of course, it can be made use of and probably to your disadvantage. Now this creates all sorts of problems even within, and of course that's a way of looking at it, even within the innovation process itself. It means, for example, how do I communicate? Well, one of the troubles is information is not completely transmissible. So if I am sure that something's going to work, I may nevertheless need financing. And I've got to persuade somebody else of this. And this, by the way, does not apply, I speak of profitability, but it could be within, let's say, a nonprofit organization, the military, for example, especially. which is not mentioned here, but is a very large R&D component. And the pharmacological industry, which also doesn't seem to be mentioned today, which is a place where I think patents play the biggest role of all compared to other areas. It's subject to a lot of, that's privately produced, but it's subject to a lot of regulation, and there are all sorts of social consequences. So it's not a simple kind of market. We have the enormous expense of testing and things like that. And the question of getting to the point of testing, to getting the financing it to that point, and with a high failure rate, by the way, but by no means it's certainly non-trivial. So I mean, it's a failure rate in the sense of not even before you get to the testing, because you don't achieve the results, and that's expensive. But then on top of that, when you put the testing, when you get to a point where something might work, you go through the really quite expensive tests, you wind up with a situation where many drugs, the cost of development is everything, and the cost of manufacturing is trivial. That's not always true, but there are certainly a lot of drugs which that's true. And it's the social intervention that creates the problems. I can remember being a little lower than the average person here, that there was a point where universities, if the university developed a product, a pharmacological product, in the course of its own research, it would be considered, what's the word I want? Unworthy. Would be considered to be wrong to patent it. If a university developed, there were drug manufacturing firms all along, but if a nonprofit group, if a university developed things, it was considered improper to patent it. That was subject to that it should be given out free. And I think one of the first examples was some University of Wisconsin developed some kind of a substitute for cod liver oil in delivering vitamin D. If you've never tasted cod liver oil, I recommend it. But it was given. It was given it by a conscientious mother to get my vitamin D, which was new. The whole idea of vitamins was new then. And the University of Wisconsin developed a more palatable version of the more palatable version. They decided they would patent it, but of course the funds were reserved solely for the purpose of further medical research. Now, no university today would take that position. Giovanni has suggested a number of topics we should be taking up. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Yes, well, the financing creates problems because I'm really convinced that my idea is certainly going to work, but I've got to get somebody to finance it. That applies to profit or not, or military organizations as well. You've got to convince somebody else. And of course, the firm may have to convince investors and so forth and so on. But how do you convey, when information is a little vague, you've got some evidence, you're convinced that it's worthwhile, you've got to convince others, and so there's a very imperfect kind of competition, and of course the patent system, as you suggested, has probably evolved enormously, even if the formal situation is unchanged, the requirements, the expectations of what's required, what's necessary, have changed, I'm sure, a great deal in practice. Let me remark on one situation which Giovanni has raised in the communication with us, what's called the linear model and the alternatives to it. Well, in the first National Bureau Conference on the Rate and Direction of Inventive Activity, which Dick and I, as a maybe the sole representatives here. It was a paper by Simon Kuznets. And it took for granted the linear model. Simon Kuznets is one of the great figures in national income accounting and so forth, but he just took for granted that scientists went along in a totally exogenous way, having to do with intellectual curiosity. And somebody says, oh, this can have a practical application. And then the steps go to that. Now, of course, there's one very obvious exception to that, which has been true for millennia, or at least a millennium. And that's that one of the products of innovation may be instruments for measurement. The telescope, after all, is somebody, I mean, lenses were known in antiquity, but somebody decided to put two lenses together. I don't know why or how, and they said, oh, you could detect ships coming in. That was the idea, you know. So telescopes around, Galileo gets a hold of one of them, and says, well, let's look at the stars instead. It was a revolution, a scientific revolution in that case, pure science. Well, it wasn't in the long run so pure because observations of the heavenly bodies turned to be very, very useful in navigation. So it fed back again. So this goes by this idea that the improvements in modern astronomy, this detection of gravitational waves, for example, that was a recent accomplishment, requires incredible degrees of accuracy. It's all based on the fact that there have been technological innovations. Certainly the art of telescopy was totally transformed in many ways. So we have things. Now, one question is, to what extent do needs, rather than just as feedback through instrumentation, what extent do needs matter? You know, we need something, or at least the word need is not literally true. What we need is something we could very much like to have. Very valuable. Well, there's an example that's always struck me about that necessity. You can want something, but some things are impossible, and other things are difficult. And then one of the standing examples to me is the electric car. Electric cars, I guess, are about as old as internal combustion engine cars, maybe a little less, but certainly. If I recall the figures, in the 1900, there were something like 1,500 cars in the United States. A third of them were steam-driven. A third of them were driven by internal combustion engines. And a third of them were electric cars. And the electric cars were quieter, smoother in their operation. You didn't have to crank them. This was before the invention of the self-starter. You could be injured if you're trying to start the car and it suddenly came to life. The engine suddenly came to life. It took about, I think it was not until about 1913 the self-starter was invented. Anyway, the electric car, now there's only one trouble with electric cars, and that's that the battery gives out. And we've known this for 100 years, more. It's only now that somehow after all, so the pressure to improve batteries was there, that there'd be a big market for long-lasting electric batteries, or for some way of recharging them or replacing them or something. That it seems to be perfectly that the monetary gain was enormous. So we have to assume that people just didn't know how to do it. And now suddenly we are, even now it's still limited compared to. So if you're driving around the town, it's all right. But if you're driving, if you wanted to, as Americans do, certainly, drive long distances, you need to right now after so all this time that we've been able to. Okay, I think I'll stop now and I will have
Thank you, Ken.
other opportunities.
Paul David?
Thank you. Thanks to the organizers of this spectacular gathering, to all the people who preceded me in making comments throughout the day. I'm going to take a little bit of an eccentric tack in the brief comments to pick up several statements. I think the earliest one in the day was by Dave Nelson, and this was echoed by Dave Mowery, who said we're not going to focus very much on the area of Nate's contributions to the history of economic thought. And while I'm not going to delve into that, there's a point.
Speak a bit louder.
There's a point which, in some respects, unifies Nate's contributions in that area with the sources of the impact that he had in economics in the field of technological change and its constituent sub-processes, which came to distinguish and draw to him a greater eager audience in the economics profession. And that point of contact between his work in the two areas is, I think, of some importance, because central to it was Nate's interest in, appreciation of, and sheer joy in identifying anomalies, in looking for phenomena that did not find satisfactory, persuasive explanations in the received doctrine. Of course, in this area we've been talking about, the patent entanglement of technological changes with the transformation of economic activity, and in turn the forces that emanated from developing economies which underwent structural changes, back on the conduct of the sub-processes which gave rise to more systematic efforts to change the economy, was a direct anomaly when, if you looked at the way in which in the mid-60s and early 70s, the mainstream economics working out the last stages to complete the dominance of the neoclassical paradigm, at least within the profession, presented in this field, as well as in the area of institutional development, of essentially nothing. They were treated as exogenous. Where they came from, they were important. They were part of the givens within which market systems worked. And Nate said, "Wait a minute, you're leaving something out here." Okay. And the area in which I think with greatest confidence and with lower expectations of having people pay much attention to what he was saying was in his work on Adam Smith. And there, repeatedly, in his publications, which appeared in the whole articles in the JPE, collected articles later. Later, I think the last of the papers was in the history of political economy. He took people more or less by the scruff of the neck. And he said, look, you think that Adam Smith is in favor of the pursuit of self-interest. Well, look carefully at the things you've never read in the Wealth of Nations, in which he says, in general, people must attend at some level to their self-interest if they are to survive, if they are to manage their affairs. There are certain needs which necessarily must be met, but people are not driven by attention simply to their own needs and willingness to not attend to the needs of others, of those around, that they actually don't seek wealth, that they do not always behave without reference to benevolence, that if they seek wealth, it is because wealth, and here he anticipates, finds in Smith, anticipates from Devlin, it is the pure esteem that one has from parading wealth.
I think take the work of Nate. All the basic ingredient building blocks of evolutionary theory are there. Let me just name telegraphically 7. 1, partly endogenous innovation as driver of economic growth. So a good deal of innovation generated by profit-motivated agent, with all the exception that Ken was telling us a minute ago about technology preceding science. I mean, maybe nowadays the denial of the linear model has gone too far, but in any case, in nature there is a precocious acknowledgement of the fact that the loop can go the other way around. Second, the related radical uncertainty associated with innovation. As Ken again repeats, if you know exactly what is an innovation, it's not an innovation, because it's already there. And with all the consequences that we'll mention in a second about non-probabilizability, absence of markets associated, again, Ken was mentioning it. Third, given that the impossibility of maximizing behavior, but rather behavior driven by heuristics, the compulsive sequences and imbalances that Paul was talking about, and constraints. The role of constraints in determining behavior. Relatedly again, a procedural view of production and innovative search, rather than choice over input and output combination. It's not production and innovation is never I choose A or I choose B because they form a neat expectation on what A and B will yield, but basically is a sequence of cognitive and physical acts that might get me there or might not get me there. And I know if I'm there or not only when I'm there or not there. Fifth, given that heterogeneous technological expectation essentially based on vague intuition, feelings on the future technological trajectories. Relatedly, of course, the intrinsic heterogeneity, because about a vague object, I've got some ideas and you've got other ideas, and possibly we're both wrong. Notice the distance between this type of expectation and the rational expectation that you find in the textbook, not to talk about rational technological expectation, that is an oxymoron. Sixth, dynamic increasing return of various kinds, both associated with the division of labor and with the cumulativeness in learning. And finally, seventh, the typically disequilibrium condition of all markets, when they exist. as again Kane was saying. These are all building blocks of evolutionary theory indeed. Why didn't evolutionary theory became a dominant paradigm? Here is where I put the blame on Nate, because he refused to take up a confrontation with Ken. In fact, Ken would have been very, very happy to have this confrontation. He was so happy and eager that in several occasions took up the confrontation against himself. What he said today was a arrow against arrow. When the article that he wrote for us in ICC in 1996 is absolutely devastating against general equilibrium theory and equilibrium theory in general. So with technical information, you lose all the properties of the standard general equilibrium, and maybe you even lose the existence. But very few of us has taken up the challenge. I mean, yes, we have this monumental work of Nelson Winter, but this should have been the beginning, and instead in the community has almost meant the end. I mean, of thorough, heavy theoretical works toward the construction of an alternative. And so, I mean, part of our community lives in a sort of parallel world. I mean, those of you that are relatively young and did microeconomics, where did they study microeconomics? On Mascolet. We did not follow up the intuition, the bottom-up intuition of Nate, of Chris, of Dick. Think of the theory of production, the theory of industrial dynamics, international trade, not to talk about, for God's sake, macroeconomics. I mean, that we live in the world of DSD. Even in the field of the theory of the firm, where progress has been more significant, there is still a long way to go. In fact, my impression is that we are in presence of a counter-reformation, in the sense that homeopathic quantities of the contribution of Nate, or Dick, Sid, and many others, are sucked in the standard paradigm, and of course, I mean, reduced, because the standard paradigm cannot swallow more, a little more than a homeopathic quantity of evolution and innovation. But for example, we have new growth theory. New growth theory say, well, new growth theory is an advantage because now we have innovation endogenous. Well, yes and no. Because we have innovation endogenous at a very high price, that we have pushed innovation within an enlarged production function in which also innovation is an act of optimal allocation of resources. So is it a progress? Maybe not. You have, and you had since the 80s, theories of equilibrium evolution, which is more or less like saying that I'm an anorexic. But more recently, you have also equilibrium rationalization of micro-heterogeneity. We have a lot of data now on firms, and this is prima facie is the best demonstration that the world is not in equilibrium and heterogeneity is the name of the game. But then you've got very clever people that come along and say, well, because you did not see a cost somewhere, if you saw a sunk cost somewhere, that must be there because we must be in equilibrium, otherwise, I mean, God would not exist any longer. Then with that unobservable, I can tell you a story that heterogeneity can be reduced to an equilibrium observation. Even, I mean, I'm sorry that our friend Bob Gibbons is not here, but when Bob Gibbons writes, again on ICC is open, I mean, it's not a party job. When Bob Gibbons writes that routines are devices to solve the multiplicity of equilibria associated with the fault theory. This, I think, is the ultimate perversion, because in the evolutionary view, routines are, routine, heuristic, etc., are the way actually people behave. Without any commitment, they don't behave like that because they see multiple equilibria, so they've got to choose. They behave like that because we live in a world of uncertainty, innovation, da 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 da. Now, even that, it is upside down, and it is used to support an equilibrium maximization view. And last but not least, all this comes associated with a lot of boredom. Compare contemporary exercises with the breadth, the freshness of Nate study. I find here a major regret, sorry.
Thank you.
Okay, first of all, a deep thanks for the organizers of this important event, maybe a milestone paralleling the Venice Conference 30 years ago. I'm not a student of Nate, unfortunately. I would have liked very much to be that. But on the other hand, I had the privilege of getting to know him closely in some kind of intellectual camaraderie over the years, with many talks and beach walks, big talks, which I really enjoy, really. So, Nate once remarked that his interest in technological change transformed him from being an economist to become an economic historian. And that illustrates how technological change not only can transform an economy, but also an economist. And in that way, you could, supposing Nate could be to some extent representative of his colleagues, you could say that those economists who have not yet been transformed into historians have no interest in technological change, which in a way is perhaps what you can observe when it comes to the traditional ignorance of technological change. This is in a way an important illustration of how technology is important for economic history, as well as economic history is important for technological change, then illustrated by Nate's own works. It's also an illustration of one recurring theme in Nate's work, and that is the discovery of feedbacks or mutual interactions at micro-technological levels. And these techno-economic feedbacks are crucial for endogenizing technology into economic theory and modeling, as we all know. And in that way, economic history and economic historians such as Nate have been tremendously important for economic theory, and not only just for the joy of understanding technological phenomena. It's, on the other hand, more difficult to find where economic theory has led economic historians to new discoveries of phenomena that could have been hypothesized on theoretical grounds. And sometimes, and often is the case in natural science, but perhaps less so in social sciences. So feedbacks may guide modelers at the same time as they make life more complicated for econometricians trying to assess causality in some range or other way. And you could also draw a conclusion that it seems practice runs ahead of theory, both when it comes to technological and economic, as well as economic domains. Then, coming to another phenomena is the Nate's conceptualizing of technological convergence, which had also been conceptualized by people like Eric Jansch in the 1960s under the heading of technological confluence, and later on by Fumio Kodama under the label of technology fusion. So there was some general recognition of this important phenomena, and Nate was the one who, I think, first recognized it and conceptualized it in important ways, as we have heard about throughout the day today. And in a way, that foreshadows the important emphasis on combining technologies, and Nate is using those language and words in several instances. So that's another example of a discovery of phenomena that Nate has provided us all with. This has led to studies of general purpose technologies, multi-technology innovations, and technological diversifications as key drivers of economic growth, and to ideas and theories of recombinant growth. So you could, in a way, generalize the phenomena of technological convergence into technological combinations, which then turn out to be important phenomena and important drivers of economic growth. So again, economic history, with its virtue of proving existence and perhaps non-uniqueness of phenomena, has led to new theories, and new growth theories in particular. However, these combinatorial processes are highly uncertain and complicates life for forecasters, some of which, by the way, are historians. Feedback again. And you can just think about the combinatorial explosion that is around the corner when it comes to combining all these arrays of new technologies in ICTs, in robotics, nanomaterials, biotech, molecular machinery, etc. And this leads to my next and final point, that this is increasing the already high levels of uncertainty of various sorts, probabilistic or genuine uncertainty. And Nate's work amply illustrates in sobering ways how difficult it is to forecast technological and economic changes deriving from technological changes. And his amusing and nice stories about various miscalculations throughout the history of technology and the history of economics is a warning that it is difficult, and it surely will be more and more difficult to make any predictions about the future impact of new technologies and innovations. One can ask, on balance, do new technologies solve more problems than they create in the long run? So that leads me to the last and more important question. How important is economic history for our economic future? And I leave it open by that. And we can all contemplate what Nate would have tried to say in answering such a question. Thank you.
I'll use this one. When I got the initial letter of invitation from Giovanni and Franco and David, and its description of this session called Roundtable session that we're participating in, they encouraged those of us who wanted to talk a bit about the importance of economic history. And that is really what I have chosen to do. And Ova did, of course, do just that, and so did Paul. When I was a graduate student many, many years ago, at Yale University, there were 3 comprehensive exams that all graduate students needed to take. They were in theory, and econometrics, and in economic history. And as I scanned what was going on at other first-grade graduate schools in economics at about that time, most of them required economic history as a primary topic that all graduate students should learn a lot about, and that had equal standing with theory and econometrics in the comprehensives that all of us were taking. That situation has eroded enormously. I don't know if does Stanford now have a requirement on a comprehensive for economic history?
It has a required field, yes.
It has a required field.
Not a comprehensive exam, but it's a...
It is a required field. Many other of your sister universities doing graduate training don't have that anymore. Many of them don't even have a course in economic history. And I think this is a very, very serious problem. There are 2 statements made by distinguished folks many, many years ago that methodological points of view that they articulated that I think got absorbed by our mother discipline, the mother discipline of many of us, much too strongly, probably during around the 1970s. One of them is, quote I will give this from Lord Kelvin. And this is sort of at the beginning of the 20th century. And it goes this way. When you can measure what you are speaking about and express it in numbers, you know something about it. But when you cannot measure it, cannot express it in numbers, your knowledge is of a meager and unsatisfactory kind. The second quote I would give that I think also has been absorbed very strongly by our brothers and sisters in economics was from Galileo, several centuries before. The universe cannot be understood unless one first learns to comprehend the language and interpret the characters in which it is written, and it is written in the language of mathematics. I note that what Kelvin and Galileo said is sort of true for contemporary physics, but is not true for any other scientific discipline that I know about. And I think taking those points of view abroad much too strongly has caused very, very serious discipline problems in economics. It is this point of view that has been pervasive in influencing most of the mainline journals and has led to a significant erosion of description and narrative in economic analysis and writing, a point that all of us have, a number of us have commented on in the talk. It certainly was there that led to the death of institutional economics as a field in the United States. That point of view changed dramatically over the course that I was teaching it, the way industrial economics was taught, or labor economics was taught. And in both of them now, as I talk to graduate students, the graduate students who are coming from those fields, many of them and most people coming from most universities, don't have the slightest idea about the details of what's going on in industry. To pick up another quote, this one from Marshall, early in the 20th century. The mecca of the economist lies in economic biology, rather than economic dynamics. And by economic dynamics, Marshall meant basically physics. Biology is very, very different than is physics. And economics is, I think we have all learned and would agree, it's much, much closer to what goes on in biology, or subject matter, or ontology, than in physics. In economics, like in biology, I would make two propositions about the subject matter. First of all, adequate characterization of most economic phenomena needs to be largely verbal and qualitative, though it can be spliced and needs to be spliced usefully by a lot of numbers. But those numbers don't make sense aside from the broader qualitative context. And I think that several people have commented that was very much Nate's point of view. Second, understanding of causal mechanisms in economics and in biology is largely qualitative. Formal models in economics and in biology really should be viewed as very, very powerful and useful aids for sharpening up, extending the logic of qualitative thoughts and for exploring new ideas. But they don't really characterize that well the view of what is basically going on in the economy that I think we should think theory as aiming to do. So I said these remarks are not meant at all to play down the role of econometrics or mathematical modeling. I've done years ago modeled ladder myself, but rather to put their use in context and to argue that they should not dominate the field and push other forms of economic analysis to the side. I think it is extremely important, both in economics department and in business schools, that history regain its centrality, both because of the valuable knowledge that doing historical research, paying real attention to the details of what is going on, working with narrative and description can provide, and because economic history teaches a very valuable style of research.
Gavin?
Would you have trouble with that?
No. In school, I was always one of the tall ones, and since my last name begins with W, I'm used to going last. But it does have certain disadvantages, as you're about to hear, especially if you do what I usually don't do, which is to write out my remarks in advance. I was Nate Rosenberg's colleague in the economic history group at Stanford. What I decided to do in preparing these remarks was to reread Nate's writing from the 1960s and early 70s before he came to Stanford in 1974 and before we became colleagues at Stanford in 1982. I was confident that as one of the few card-carrying economic historians in the room that no one would make any significant mention of Nate's article on machine tools in the Journal of History of 1963. Even though Tim Bresnahan was right down the hall, we did not coordinate, and I did not know that he was going to build his whole analysis this morning. I will comment on that in just a minute. That piece came with a story that Nate loved to tell. Although it had been invited by and presented to the Conference on Income and Wealth, the paper was then dropped from the conference volume because it had no numbers. Yet, according to historian David Hounshaw, the article, quote, remains to this day perhaps the single most influential essay ever written in the history of technology. Talk about an unintended consequence. It was published in a prominent economic history journal, getting far more visibility and attention than it ever would have had buried in a conference volume. What made the essay so distinctive? Nate described the origins of specialized machine tools firms as spin-offs from the machine shops associated with the early American textile industry. That birth story was missing from Tim's narrative this morning. And he then recounted the extension by these firms of their accumulated machine-making capabilities to a sequence of otherwise distinct products in diverse industries. Sewing machines, locomotives, typewriters, bicycles, and eventually the automobile. This identification of technological commonalities across conventional industry lines that Nate called technological convergence. I've heard that term several times today, but I think almost always in relation to this article. And what I wrote here is a term that is not really stuck. But as one rereads the essay, with the advantage of more than 50 years of hindsight, it becomes clear that Nate was describing processes now commonly discussed under the heading general purpose technologies. But Nate's historical formulation is better than calling it a GPT, it seems to me, because he was describing not a technology with certain attributes, but a structure of innovation through which progress was channeled in particular directions by incentives. And if you heard Tim this morning, you might have gotten the idea, I don't know if this is quite what he meant, but you might have gotten the idea that the machine tools industry, as depicted in that article, was passively responding to demands from a changing sequence of user industries. That is not what Nate wrote about and not what I see there. He saw the machine tool industry as aggressively promoting and seeking out new markets for their accumulated knowledge and machine-making expertise. To a boy with a nail, the whole world looks like a hammer. Well, to an industry with a set of know-how, every other industry is one that might make up a potential customer. And if you want a vivid example, although this is not in the article itself, it was the active role of the textile machinery industry in promoting the transfer of modern textile technology from north to south. Many of the southern communities that became little villages were very unpromising indeed, lacking prior expertise, lacking knowledge about markets, maybe even having an unfavorable climate. Well, the textile machinery industry stood ready to assist with all of those difficulties, including technical expertise in getting set up and even advancing credit at times if local capital markets were not adequate. Let me continue. Over the decade, Nate developed and extended these insights in several directions. In much of this work, he was contending with the nihilism of theorists who questioned the entire idea of directed technological change. I think it helps to have that intellectual context in trying to read that article and many of the other pieces from that era. If factors of production are paid their marginal products and inputs are combined in optimal cost-minimizing fashion, why should there be any incentive to economize at any one factor rather than another? In response, Nate recounted historical settings, laying out the technical issues with great specificity in which major players, that is to say producers or designers of machine technology, perceived a technological imbalance whereby breaking through a particular bottleneck would open the door to a wide range of new technologies that could draw upon relatively abundant resources. The broader point was that technological trajectories could be driven by, quote, internal compulsions and pressures, which is not the same as saying that they were driven by non-economic motives. But in order to identify these and to study them, one really has to venture inside the black box of the technological world, rather than creating aggregated empirical proxies such as total factor productivity or patent counts, and then treating these as though they really measure the state of technology itself. Nate has been wonderfully influential, but on that basic intellectual strategy, I fear it's a losing battle. Because young scholars who have to do empirical work are so tempted by these available indicators. The Rosenberg perspectives have indeed been highly influential for research and writing in the history and economic history of technology. Many examples could be cited, but the one I will mention here is my long-term project with Gary Saxonhouse on the technological progress and diffusion in cotton spinning, the first truly global industry. Very much in the spirit of Nate's account of technological trajectories driven by unfolding internal logic, we found the rise of American ring spinning in the 19th century defined not just a technical alternative to Britain's mule-based system, but an alternative technological paradigm for the emerging industries around the world to choose. Although the term diffusion may imply that the newer technology was superior to the old, in reality both ring and mule were technologically progressive and each had their engineering advocates. Divisions tending to fall along lines of national engineering networks, as would not surprise a diligent reader of Rosenberg. The fighting back power of old technologies was indeed one of Nate's favorite themes. This era of dueling paradigms fundamentally changed, however, when Japanese producers in the 1890s figured out how to adapt the American rig technology to their labor-abundant setting by adopting a new package of complementary components, including importation of longer staple American cotton and developing a labor-intensive cotton mixing stage adapted to the more stringent material requirements of ring spinning. A Schumpeterian innovation indeed. And I just regret that Gary and I were too slow in getting our work out, and Gary died in 2006, so we never really got a chance to get Nate's full reaction to our project. But I suppose that even in this sympathetic audience, the question on many people's minds is to what extent these historical insights from the 19th century carry over to the more technologically advanced economies of the 20th and 21st centuries. That profound question is one to which Nate devoted much attention in the latter part of his career, and I will not attempt to summarize his view or my view of it in the brief time available. But I will venture the assessment, and indeed that was exactly what Tim was doing in the paper he presented this morning. I will venture the assessment that contemporary discussions of the pace and impact of technological change in our own times would be considerably enriched by greater awareness of and familiarity with Nate's legacy. When the Society of History of Technology awarded Nate the Da Vinci Medal in 1996, the citation described him as having, quote, almost single-handedly changed the way economists and economic historians think about technology and technological change. That is beautiful language. But I added the comment in the brief obituary that's on the conference website, perhaps so, but today's growth theorists and theometricians would be well advised to read him in the original. As a case in point, consider Robert Gordon's best-selling book, The Rise and Fall of American Growth. Gordon asserts that the pace of technological change has declined since its heyday in the mid-20th century, and that this alleged fact accounts for the stagnation of American living standards and productivity in recent times. These propositions have generated a division among reviewers between pessimists who agree with Gordon and optimists who have faith that technology can rise to new challenges in the future as it has in the past. But Gordon's book has no citation to Rosenberg and reflects little appreciation of the perspective that Nate developed over his lifetime, namely that gains in productivity and living standards are not direct reflections of technological progress, but instead reflect complex adoption, adaptation, interactions between technology generators and technology users. To any participants in the optimism-pessimism debate who might aspire to develop a more informative understanding of technology as part of a national and now global innovation system, my advice would be the same. Begin by reading Nate Rosenberg in the original.
Well, we've heard from everybody. What a fantastic panel. I just asked the panelists to keep their notes because this is worthy of publication somewhere. We'll find a place. But let me ask you all to please acknowledge their wonderful presentation and report.